Good morning to the conference for the last conference of the year. And I take this privileged time to participate in the ongoing conversation on gender and church, focusing on patriarchy. As part of my introduction in participating in this conversation, I think it is important that I introduce myself. I know that many of you would know that this is Zukisa Fumba. I am the minister in the Methodist Church of Southern Africa. And I also recently taken a responsibility as a gender desk convener of our district here in Highveld and Eswatini. And I am a black male. I am a Xhosa man with traits in my upbringing, with traits of ideologies of patriarchy. I am also a traditional man who come from the socialization which is influenced by tradition. At the same time, I must confess that I am a clergy, the one with a duty to nurture congregation. You could hear that kind of the being of me and the person and the identity of who I am. At the same time, I am a feminist, the one who challenges patriarchy in calling and attaining all people to have equal opportunities as rights, both women and men. I am also an ally to the LGBTI plus Q community. I am on the side of the LGBTIQ plus. I'm a friend to the community. And I want to also say that I am a beneficiary of patriarchy. I just want to move this. Yes, I am a beneficiary of patriarchy. And, as the one who has, been conscious of my identity and my benefits, as the one who benefited, and by the way, continues to benefit from patriarchy. And I think that's enough, about me, and I'd like to go into the topic. But I think it is important as we're seeking resources, theological resources and practical resources to grapple with the issue. And this I call the dominating evil in humanity, which is patriarchy. Let me start by also saying that patriarchy, you agree with this common and international understanding of patriarchy as the male dominance, a very comprehensive male dominance and an oppressive one, which Maluleka, in one of his articles in 2009, says it's a supremacy ideology, as it's so comprehensive and it's very oppressive. And this male dominance, it is in households, in homes, in churches, in workplaces, communities, that's where we find the existence of the male dominance. And this is a system that it sustains itself, through very complex forms, which we could easily trace them in the places that I submitted earlier on, that the male dominance is found from homes to the streets, in our communities, in our workplaces. And we also find in the Bible very much glimpses in the book of Esther, chapter 2, about the power of maleness. We'll recall Esther, the one who was a virgin, but she had no power, but yet her virginity story that we find here is the one that gave maleness the power to maleness. We recall the uncle of Esther, the one with the privilege of being a male. he actually enjoyed the benefits of the beauty of Esther. And so we find a maleness, patriarchy in many aspects of life. And this is just one of the examples of male dominance, which we found also from Mordecai, who actually got the honor and the financial privilege of the beauty of Esther. And so as we try to understand before we unpack the theological resources that can help us as the people of faith, as help us as a communities to grapple proactively, to grapple in action with the issues of patriarchy as, in my view, as the product of church and gender. Patriarchy is the product for me of church and gender. And so we find very much of the stereotypes in the construction and the maintenance of the patriarchy from the early church fathers, and the philosophers like Aristotle, who declared that within mankind, the man is more perfect than a woman. And I think that statement, that understanding and declaration of the power that is bestowed and was given socially from the early church fathers and the philosophers, that requires a moment for us as we grapple with patriarchy as a form that actually rejects the identity of humanity as we find it from the scriptures. That on that statement alone, it is a statement that created the divide and creates the divide between women and men. And so that on its own identifies men to be on top, as we understand in the sexual activities that men were identified to be on top, to assume the active role. And then this, for me, I see it as one of the problems that has created the existence, the complexity of patriarchy, when it comes to dealing with the matters, the social matters of humanity, when it's dealing with also our faith, expression of our faith. In dealing with patriarchy, I think it is also important that we understand the present harming stereotypes. The present harming stereotypes, firstly, about God, because patriarchy in its own nature, it's seeks to reject, and it rejects who God is understood, who God is from the sacred text. You will recall one of the stereotypes about God, that God is a man. That on its own has given us so much complexity and problem in seeing males, in seeing men as only an absolute representation of God. That kind of stereotype, it is very harming. It is a stereotype that doesn't help in the grappling about patriarchy, in our ways of seeking to challenge patriarchy, to strip and deconstruct patriarchy. Another stereotype about men, people like myself, the stereotype that men are strong, men are leaders, men are not emotional, and men, they talk less, and men represent, as I said earlier on, they represent God as one of the stereotypes, and men protect, and men are providers. Those stereotypes, they are a problem, and they need to be looked at. They need us as the church and the people of faith to actually pause, and find ways to challenge and reject such harming stereotypes. Such stereotypes, they are not just traditional stereotypes, but they are also present stereotypes. We also find other stereotypes about women, that women are weak, women are emotional, women are to submit, women, they talk too much, and women are children carers, and they represent some form of evil in that distorted understanding of the story of Eve. As you know, you also find in the book of Jeremiah how women worshiping represents and is seen to be evil if one looks in the book of Jeremiah. But we find these stereotypes, and some of the stereotypes, if we were to take the moment to pause, for example, the one that says women are emotional, maybe we need to pause on that particular one and find and ask the question, what can we harvest from that one? Is God not emotional? Was Jesus, by the way, let me just go there. Was Jesus not emotional? When the one who cried, the one who had a deep sense of compassion to his beloved friend Lazarus, when he heard that he died, so he wept for the passing on. And for me, being emotional, it is the nature of humanity. Human beings are emotional people. That is just an example to say that maybe as men, if we see, those of us who see that we are not emotional, that element, that identity of emotionality, maybe we ought to claim it as something that we can celebrate, because maybe some of the things in life, we actually miss them, because we do not want to show that part of ourselves that society sees as weakness. And maybe it's the time as we unpack and grapple with patriarchy and say that men ought to learn to be emotional. And friends, I think, as churches, as people of faith, we ought to find ways of not just rushing and mentioning these stereotypes, but taking a step, to pause onto them and reject the others that are not in line with who we are as human beings, because these are one of the foundations that has entrenched and maintained the existence of male dominance, to see women as weaker being and see men as more strong, to see women as the one whom, these stereotypes saying that, we find in the society, we say women, they talk too much, men are logical, they've got a logical approach of doing things, and maybe we need to stop and ask the question, is that the truth? Is that the image of God that we place in these stereotypes? And another way of trying to grapple with patriarchy, I think one of the things that we as a society, especially those of us who benefit from patriarchy, we tend to be ignorant. We play ignorance. You hear someone saying that, I wasn't aware that women in the church are not treated equally as men. I was really not aware that women, or rather, I was not aware that, the way how women are actually treated in the church, it's injustice, it's violation of humanity. I thought that is the way of life. And so I want to submit, friends, again, this time, that The ignorance is one of the things that hinders us in grappling in life-giving ways, about patriarchy, about church and gender, specifically when it comes to the male power and the male dominance. And that on the ignorance on its own, it is just one of the scapegoat ways of not wanting to include others. You hear other people saying that, no, I grew up in a context whereby local preachers are men, and it was not for women to be local preachers. We still have people in some contexts. I'm just looking just in this southern part of Africa without even looking at other parts of the world. So I think that that for me, when we begin to actually acknowledge our ignorance and accept that we have been too ignorant, because we have seen us as men, for instance, as the only people who ought to be the vehicles of life, the vehicles of the gospel, the vehicle of transformation. And now, if it's a woman, we find that it is so abnormal. It's something we haven't seen in a particular context. I know that there are churches that are still struggling to comprehend that God had and still has a call, a vocation for both women and men. And so I think this conference gives us another opportunity for us to pause upon our ignorances and also upon our mannerism towards women, the things that we say about women in our speeches, in the jokes and the insult that we make of women. For me, I think that is also one of the behaviors of patriarchy. What does it take to create? I'm looking at the time. What does it create? What does it take to create a church where women are free? I believe that as we grapple with the theological resources to deal with patriarchy, as one of the components of gender in church, focusing on the patriarchy, I believe that we ought to be intentionally in exploring biblical text, biblical text, whether text of terror or text of embracing women. We need to be intentionally in exploring biblical text. We find also in the book of Romans chapter 16, there is a passage, it's a passage that embraces women that we can use as a resource to actually strip down the patriarchy. The patriarchy, I can't say the bad patriarchy, because I can never find a good patriarchy, because patriarchy in its nature is too evil. So I also think that, as we explore biblical texts, we need to point also the violation of the word of God, as we pick up some text and how they've been misinterpreted for purposes of actually embracing a particular agenda of male dominance. And I also think that we also need to engage church history, very critical. I know that the early church fathers have been such a gift into the church, but the early church fathers has also helped in the distortion of the imago Dei, of the image of God in humanity. I mentioned earlier on the philosophers who actually they were actually saying that women are incomplete beings. Unless a woman becomes a man, then that particular woman is not a full being. So for a woman to be a full human being, some early church fathers / philosophers, said, if a woman were to become a man, then the woman will be a full human being. And I think that on its own rejects the imago Dei. It rejects the image of God in women. So I think that needs to be challenged as we continue to challenge it, that the image of God is found in both females and males. So that on its own, that statement that was said by the early church fathers was inscribing men to be God, men to be only as a representative of God. But we know that the scriptures in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, it is very clear that the females and the males are made in the image of God. And I think, friends, if we want to be authentic and real, to challenge the patriarchy, the premises should be the image of God as the people of church. If we truly believe and proclaim the gospel of Christ, then we need to do everything we can, every life-giving thing that we can to actually celebrate the image of God. Because the patriarchy to date has not celebrated the image of God. It has only celebrated the image of God at the expense of another image of God. And so our attempts of grappling with this complexity of gender and church, specifically when it comes to how us as men has taken an absolute part of control and power, not only in church, but from church into society. I also think one of the theological resources is in our practical ways of being the public witnesses of our faith, in that we need to find a way to challenge a violent culture, a violent culture that is not life-giving to either women or men. As a people of church, I know some of us, we come from contexts where there are practices, cultural practices, that are so harmful, but we keep quiet. I think as the church, we have a role, we have a responsibility, to be the public witnesses of freedom for all people. So with all due respect to our cultures, we respect the cultures, but if a culture, it does not bring life, if we test it according to our way of life in obedience to the word of God, if it doesn't, I want to submit again as a theological resource of grappling with patriarchy. We ought to challenge it and find ways to challenge it. What can we do to undermine patriarchy? One of the simple but yet so difficult in us to do, women leadership is one of the tools, is one of the acts of undermining patriarchy, at all levels, from local levels, from cell groups, class meetings, where people gather in the covenants, worship, coming together to pray together and share their souls together, up to the senior leadership of the church. I believe that women leadership is a very practical and a biblical way that we can use to undermine patriarchy. In the Methodist Church, I'm proud to say that in the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, in the attempts of the church to undermine patriarchy, the conference 2019 of the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, this needed not to be regulated. but because people of faith are still struggling to deal with the fact that the church leaders are also women, are not just men. So the Methodist Church made the resolution that at a particular level of the church of leadership, there's a particular code that needs to be representing women. And I think that is one of the ways to actually to unsettle those of us, the culture within our churches and our communities of understanding those to lead to be only men. And another one, I want to believe that very much authentic reflections about our vocation. As I said earlier on, that, Kalpath talks about the position is that all men and women have the vocation. So, and that for me is so critical in our ways of trying to grapple and undermine the patriarchy. Earlier on, I spoke about the harming stereotypes, whereby it says about women that women are emotional. The emotional element, the fiber of boys ought to be nurtured as well. And for me, that on its own will undermine patriarchy. Boys to be taught how to cry, how to make girls not to cry. And for me, that is one of the practical ways that we can undermine patriarchy. Friends, I know that I don't have much of the time, but as I was saying earlier on, we need as men first to challenge other men. We need as church to accept and confess that as the church, we have been for many decades preservers and maintainers of the patriarchy. I think as a church, like we have done so with apartheid in South Africa specifically, where we declared apartheid as sin. As the church, we need to declare patriarchy as the sin. Unless we get to that level of confession and declaration, then our grappling will just be window dressing, because it will not be found in the way in which we profess our faith. I believe that as the church, dealing with the complexities of gender within the church, specifically on the aspect of patriarchy, the church, us as the church, we need to not to rush, but to be under a very sense of agents to actually declare patriarchy as the source of evil, as the evil to church, as that which undermines God, as that which undermines the image of God. Women and men are bearers of the image of God. And so, friends, in conclusion, I want to say that as the church, we need to challenge and revise our doctrines, and our practices of patriarchy. We need to challenge them. There are some churches whereby the bishops will come together and find it normal that, in their discernment, that a woman should not lead in this season, is not probably ready to lead in this season, as they would discern. And I believe that such patriarchal practices of enforcing and ensuring that male dominance continues ought to be challenged. And we as a church, we need to even challenge our theology. We need to also embrace multiple interpretations of the text. And for me, that is one of the critical places of grappling with patriarchy, to be able to challenge, or rather to be able to embrace multiple interpretations of text. And so, friends, I know this sounds like a very normal statement to say that in our ways of trying to grapple with patriarchy, the church needs to fix its language of preaching, and the language of celebrating and adoring God. And that, for me, it will create a space for women in particular, when it comes to patriarchy, to also feel that church is not a place for men, but it's a place for men and women, is a place for women and men to express the gifts of the image of God in both women and men. And friends, may we continue to grapple, may we continue to be practical, may we continue to challenge even the uncomfortable practices in the church where they embrace male power, even when it comes to placing women, or rather to placing women in leadership, or electing them in leadership, in position of power. We need to find a way to not just elect them in position of power and wait for them to fail, but we need to create an environment and the support that those who are women in the position of power, they're in the position of power and are having power. Unlike in many of our churches, where we will find, and also outside the church, women elected in position of power, but those who are having power are still males. I thank you.